Total war is all-encompassing, a war without boundary or limitation. In the Second World War, massive armies advanced, confronting whole populations with impossible choices. The manufacture of weapons transformed industry and the workforce. Area bombing campaigns reduced cities to rubble. Sieges doomed populations to starvation. Racial policies sponsored campaigns of genocide. At the heart of this conflict were ordinary people who would reveal both the best and worst of humanity. People whose lives were lost or mortgaged to the demands of total war. To fight a total war, munitions industries had to be revitalized, populations mobilized, and economies refocused towards war. Attempts were made in the 1920s and early 1930s to maintain peace. But as treaty after treaty was violated, it became clear that total war was increasingly probable. By the mid-1930s, nations began to mobilize in earnest.
So right through the interwar years, people are very aware that a new total war will require mass mobilization. Indeed, this is one of the fears people had, that another great war would have tremendous economic as well as political and ideological consequences.
The threat of total war sparked an arms race for ever greater numbers of technologically advanced weapons. Total war would be fought in the factories as well as on the battlefields, by workers as well as soldiers. Many believed victory would be won by whichever nation could produce and deploy the greatest number of weapons. This understanding of the strain that total war would put on nations inspired rounds of peace agreements. In the 1920s and early 1930s, a series of conferences and agreements were created in the hope of maintaining peace and preventing an arms race. Though some of these pacts met with initial success, the momentum towards total war steadily increased as each agreement faltered. There were high hopes for the disarmament conferences in Geneva in February 1932 and 1933. Representatives from 60 countries attended. But negotiations failed when Germany sought military parity with other Western powers and rejected any plan that didn't deliver it. The hope of a world with fewer weapons was finally dashed when both Germany and Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933.
It is now clear that the disarmament conference will not fulfill what is its sole object, namely general disarmament. The German government is accordingly compelled to leave the disarmament conference.
One by one, as these numerous promises of peace were broken, total war looked more and more likely. Nations across the globe began to prepare.
I think we need to think in terms of what, at the time, statesmen, scholars, military thinkers of all ideological shades thought mobilization meant. And what they really thought it meant at core was the mobilization of the power of the state to affect the economy, markets, to put people in jobs and positions in uniform with ever greater force.
Hitler began planning for rearmament as early as 1933, but kept his activities secret from the international community until 1935. Thereafter, as he openly defied the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler's path to total war became increasingly clear to the international community.
By about 1936, you're seeing the globe beginning to arm. What's interesting is that there was an assumption that those states that had dictatorships, that had state-controlled economies, had a lead in rearmament.
The Reich's law for the construction of the armed forces reintroduced conscription, included plans for the expansion of the Navy and Army, with the Army to reach 580,000 men by 1939. Versailles had kept the Army at 100,000. The new Air Force would combine with the Navy and Army to create the Wehrmacht. Hitler's four-year plan, launched in 1936, laid out his aims for rearmament. In 4 years, Hitler demanded the German army must be ready for combat, and the German economy must be capable of war. The heart of the plan was self-sufficiency, or autarky.
The German armed forces often talked about having some sort of economic dictator, someone who would come in and subordinate the aircraft manufacturers, the armored fighting vehicle manufacturers, petroleum industry, and so on, to create an independent, self-sufficient economy. Externally, it looked like Nazi Germany was mobilizing to some sort of grand Machiavellian plan, and it was all going to be perfect. And outsiders tended to assume this. So French and British military intelligence assumed that the Germans were doing everything efficiently and beautifully. The truth is, it was disorder and chaos on the inside.
One example of such inefficiency was the lack of standardization across German industry. At one point, German factories were producing 425 different kinds of airplanes, 151 types of trucks, 150 different motorcycles. When Germany went to war, this diversity, which made staggering demands on the spare parts inventory, was to prove disastrous.
When we think about Goering running the four-year plan, I mean, he may have been once a great aviator, but did he understand the fundamentals of running the German economy? I don't think so.
In response to the increasing threat of war, Britain followed a dual strategy of rearmament and appeasement. These diplomatic solutions sometimes came at a cost to others. Germany invaded Austria in March 1938. The Union, or Anschluss, was confirmed a month later by orchestrated plebiscite, returning a vote 99.7% in favor. Britain did not see the Anschluss as a threat, so did not oppose it. The Saar region had also been returned to Germany following a plebiscite in 1935.
Joy day in the Saar. Germany exults in reunion with her divorced province.
Hitler was taking tentative steps towards his goal of a greater Germany and finding little opposition. Lebensraum, living space, which meant expansion to the east, must follow. The sacrifice of the Sudetenland in the Munich Agreement was the most cynical example of Britain's appeasement policies in action. The Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia included about 3 million people of German origin. Hitler began planning for the occupation of Czechoslovakia in May 1938. As the situation escalated and war looked imminent, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler to negotiate. After a series of negotiations, a four-power conference was held to decide the issue. In September 1938, the leaders of Britain and France complied with Hitler's demands. The Sudetenland was surrendered to Germany in exchange for a hollow promise of peace.
Britain was very much influenced by its experience in the First World War. The cost in blood and treasure had been so great that there was a feeling that if in any way they could negotiate a war away, that is, appease Hitler in particular, they would do it.
The Munich Agreement and the appeasement strategy did not secure peace for our time, as Chamberlain claimed. But it did buy time enough for Britain to continue to scale up preparations for war.
What's important to understand about the arms race from 1936 to 1941 is that it's not simply about building up forces, not building ships, not just about building tanks or men. It's about expanding the economic base, regimenting people, and securing the resources you need to wage toward war.
As nations edged closer to total war, an ever-increasing amount of the British national budget was being allocated to defence. In 1935, the British Royal Navy was the largest in the world, and the Royal Air Force was among the most powerful. It was only the army that remained relatively small as part of a strategy that sought to fight total war at arm's length.
What does this mean? It means no conscription, either in the United Kingdom or in the rest of the empire. It means a focus on attacking not enemy armed forces, but enemy populations and enemy industry. The means to do this were what we might call today high-tech weapons, a very powerful Royal Navy and a very powerful Air Force centered on bombing. Now, the aim of this was to achieve offensive power at a low cost, both a financially low cost and a low cost in terms of the non-militarization of British society.
The French invested in defence. Work began on the Maginot Line in 1930. This heavily fortified defensive barrier, running parallel to the border with Germany, would repel an invasion and prevent repetition of the catastrophic losses of the First World War, so long as the invaders were obliging enough to come in the expected direction. The Maginot Line was defense-based on the lessons of trench warfare, and in the event would be no match for the mobility of the Blitzkrieg in the war to come. But the French were allied to a country that was, thanks to its empire, a true superpower.
The two greatest empires in the world, the French Empire and the British Empire, were united and could quite reasonably anticipate emerging victorious over Germany should there be a war with Germany.
In the Soviet Union, Stalin anticipated a future war, knowing his nation was not as prepared as it could be.
The Soviet Union expected war for a very long time, and they knew that they were behind. They had lost the First World War. They assumed that one of the reasons they lost was that they were not adequately prepared.
By implementing a series of 5-year plans, ruthless programs of collectivization and industrialization, Stalin transformed the Soviet Union into an industrialized socialist state.
There's a very drastic appreciation of the potential dangers of living in what they perceived as capitalist encirclement, that is the only socialist country, and the perception was that everybody wanted to invade them.
Collectivization gathered individually owned farms into state collective farms. The plan aimed to free laborers for work in factories. The implementation was brutal. An estimated 5 million supposedly wealthier peasants, known as kulaks, were killed or deported. The 5-year plans also nationalized industry and services. A large share of the investment was directed into heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods. This command economy helped prepare the nation for total war. The 5-year plans shattered the lives of millions. They also militarized the Soviet Union so that it was better prepared to fight a total war than it might otherwise have been.
For example, in 1927, the Soviet Union produced only 500 motor vehicles. 13 years later, in 1940, they're producing 200,000. It says a lot about the 5-year plans that Stalin initiates and just how heavily focused they were on heavy industry and on armaments. This is key to surviving the German invasion of the Soviet Union.
When the Germans launched their invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, the gaps in Soviet preparations for war became clear.
But we must also be careful in looking at Soviet production. The material itself does not account for military effectiveness. In other words, we shouldn't confuse the two. You need a full system of war to truly utilize all of this production, and that means good doctrine, good training, and good command culture.
The leadership of the Red Army had been severely compromised by the 1937 purges, in which some of the Red Army's greatest leaders had been charged with involvement in a Nazi-Soviet plot. Thousands were executed, and tens of thousands discharged from their positions. The Great Purge seriously weakened the army as the nation prepared for total war. But the Soviet Union was able to hold against the German invasion because it mobilized its resources and population so effectively. Because it drew the invaders into enormous territory, stretching supply lines. Because the Russian winter was a powerful ally. And because the Red Army did not stop fighting.
For the Soviet case, it's, I think, nearly an ideal typical total war. The activities of the state focus nearly completely and exclusively on mobilization to war and on provision of the Red Army, to the extent that they give up a lot of things they had done about controlling civilian consumption, distribution, and basically lets locals deal with it.
The United States abstained from mobilizing for war altogether in the 1930s. Weary of European wars and equally wary of bankers and munitions dealers who sought to make their fortunes in war, the focus remained on neutrality for as long as possible. Weapons manufacturers were also reluctant to get involved again. When the armistice came into effect at the end of the First World War, government munitions contracts had been abruptly terminated. Tax laws prevented companies from writing off machines which were not worn out or obsolete. Factories across the country were demolished, including what was at the time the biggest rifle manufacturing plant in the world.
On the other hand, as Europe darkened over the 1930s, you had an increasing group of people who thought that the safety of the United States was very much tied up with keeping Europe out of war. And so therefore, the difficulty of the United States in the 1930s was with the Depression, when 1/3 of the country was out of work for a considerable time, and the fact that because of this, the US didn't really have a foreign policy in the 1930s. No one really knew what they wanted to do, or if they did know what they wanted to do, they weren't sure they could actually accomplish it. So moving towards the Second World War in the United States, you had a lot of confusion.
In September 1939, one poll suggested that at least 2/3 of the population had no desire to provide aid to the Allies. But within a few short years, the United States was transformed from an isolationist nation intent on neutrality to the arsenal of democracy. To create the arsenal, President Roosevelt ramped up the defense budget.
We must increase production facilities for everything needed for the Army and Navy for national defense.
The most prominent examples was the Second Naval Expansion Act signed by the President in July 1940, which granted $4 billion towards construction for the Navy. In December 1940, a year before the United States declared war, President Roosevelt made it clear that to preserve American independence against the Nazi threat, American production had to mobilize. Rearmament was essential. Providing weapons to the nations fighting against the Nazis would, Roosevelt hoped, enable the US to stay out of the fight. The distribution of the arsenal began with Lend-Lease.
Lend-Lease was put in place because President Roosevelt, and then gradually other members of the administration, the Congress, decided if the United Kingdom, and indeed the Empire, was not supported, it was going to go under. One of the isolation laws had said no one could buy anything unless they bought it with cash and carried it back in their own ships. Well, increasingly, Britain didn't have any cash.
Aware of the need to remain neutral in law, if not in thought, President Roosevelt sought a solution. If Britain could not pay for supplies, the United States would lend them with payment later in the form of a consideration rather than cash. US Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in early 1941.
So our country is going to be what our people have proclaimed it must be, the arsenal of democracy.
It would have been very difficult for the United Kingdom, extremely difficult, for them to pay for ships, to pay for men, to pay for whatever the accoutrements of war might be. And of course, Russia was in that sense the same. The United States gave food, and it gave munitions, it gave steel, it gave all sorts of things that these countries could not have produced.
Lend-Lease ultimately extended some $50 billion in assistance to as many as 40 nations, including Great Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and British Commonwealth countries. But the policy was not purely altruistic.
The thing is, although Churchill called it the most unsorted act in history, and in a sense it was, on the other hand, the United States during the war used Lend-Lease to impose a lot of policies on the United Kingdom, for one, that were very hurtful. Lend-Lease, as far as I'm concerned, was also for the United States a weapon, a real weapon, to try to replace the pound with the dollar and to replace Britain as the major financial power in the world with the United States. And of course it worked.
As the arms race developed through the 1930s, the total war to come was, in a sense, already being fought. The outcome of the war was determined as much on the factory floor as on the battlefield. Production was vital for victory. As the major powers prepared for war in Europe, production increased exponentially. Factories went into overdrive. In 1933, for instance, Britain produced 633 aircraft, Germany 368, and France produced none at all. The Soviet Union, in comparison, produced 2,595 aircraft. By the last year of the decade, France produced over 2,000 aircraft. Germany had caught up to the Soviet Union's level of production, with both producing over 10,000 aircraft each. Britain produced the greatest number that year, with over 15,000 aircraft manufactured. Once the United States entered the war, its factories and factory workers made a significant difference to the Allied war effort. If total war relied on the factory, the American factories were willing and able to deliver victory.
The United States, until after the Second World War, didn't believe in huge standing armies and navies. They could be a threat, and they cost money. So the mobilizing, both militarily, in terms of the Navy, in terms of industry, and in terms of manpower, really all began once the United States was in the war.
Americans are preparing with all possible speed to take their places on the battlefronts. Workers in the mills and the mines are laboring long hours under great pressure to turn out the weapons and the equipment without which the war cannot be won.
Over the course of the war, American manufacturers shifted their focus to war production. US manufacturers produced in excess of 300,000 aircraft compared to Germany's 111,000 and Japan's 76,000. American factories produced over 88,000 tanks, contrasted with German output of some 46,000 and Japan's 2,500. The significance of the contribution of United States production to the war effort becomes increasingly clear. Perhaps most startling was the number of military trucks which rolled off the United States assembly lines. some 2.38 million, compared to around 345,000 for Germany and 165,000 for Japan. By 1943, the US was said to be producing a tank every 5 minutes, an aircraft every half hour, and an aircraft carrier every week. When Britain mobilized, it drew not only on its own national resources and population, but those of its empire. This belies the common perception that Britain stood alone against the Axis powers in 1940.
After the Second World War, many Britons prided themselves on having mobilized more than any other nation. That's to say, the United Kingdom had a higher proportion of soldiers plus arms workers to total population of any belligerent nation. In fact, that is a very misleading statistic. The reason the United Kingdom was able to mobilize so much was that the British Empire and the United States wanted it so mobilized and supported it with raw materials and with food so that it could do precisely that.
Canadian industry contributed vehicles, weapons, ships and aircraft. Over the course of the war, Canadian factories produced more than 800,000 military transport vehicles and 16,000 military aircraft. The extent to which the United Kingdom could wage total war was contingent upon the efforts and commitment of the people of the British Empire.
If one looks at the case of the Soviet Union or indeed Nazi Germany, there we see a much greater commitment to war. But the extent of mobilization in terms of people at the front or in the arms factories is limited by the fact that these countries have to grow their own food. They have to produce their own raw materials.
Germany also relied on the work of forced laborers to sustain its war effort. The number of slave laborers Germany pressed into service in 5 years was at least equal to the number that crossed the Atlantic during almost 400 years of the slave trade. Food and raw materials were vital to waging total war. For nations which relied on imports for food supply, this could present considerable problems.
Really, the root cause of the war start way back in the 1870s when the European population start to shift away from a grain-based diet towards a meat and milk-based diet. And that means you have to import a lot more fodder to feed the animals to produce the meat and the milk and so on. And for Britain, that's fine, but that was a real problem for Germany.
In Germany, the raw materials took priority over food supplies.
Goering was quite serious when he said, we've chosen guns over butter, because they didn't want to spend money on importing fodder from Denmark or bacon or milk or whatever to feed the working classes. They want to spend it on iron from Sweden to rearm. That makes them aggressive, that makes them look to the east. That's always the plan, that they will invade Russia and take over Eastern Europe in order to grow food for the German population.
Access to resources was a great strength for the British war effort. It did not have to rely solely on internal resources to prosecute the war. But it also made the nation vulnerable. Imports traveled by sea. The support offered by the US through Lend-Lease would have come to nothing if maritime supply lines were compromised. The German Navy sought to use U-boats to blockade, starve, and ultimately defeat Britain. The fight to secure the supply lines against German U-boats was known as the Battle of the Atlantic.
It was the vital logistic battle of the war. Whether it failed or succeeded on either side really determined the course of the war, and how well it was going profoundly influenced what each side could be doing in other campaigns.
German U-boat commander Admiral Karl Dönitz fought the Battle of the Atlantic with total war in mind. But he also faced competition from other arms of the German military for men and resources. Dönitz saw the Battle of the Atlantic as a tonnage war, a race between the number of ships his submarines or U-boats could sink, and and the speed with which the Allies could bring new ships and crews into production.
It's usually thought that the main impediment to British imports were the submarines that were attacking merchant ships in the Atlantic. In fact, really the main impediment was the lack of merchant ships. More and more merchant ships were needed because trade routes had become very much longer, and the threat of submarines meant you had to convoy ships together in large numbers, which delayed the movement of ships. So it's not the submarines themselves that are significant, it's the potential effect of submarines.
At the height of the U-boat campaign, the wolf packs stalked Allied convoys and ravaged ships. The Allies lost 575 ships to the U-boats in the last 6 months of 1942. The British understood the dire threat the U-boats posed. The campaign had the potential to starve both war industries and the population. It had the potential to bring the nation to its knees. In 1943, Winston Churchill asserted in a statement to the House of Commons that the U-boat warfare takes the first place in our thoughts.
In May, the German Admiralty made extreme exertions. To meet this, the British, American and Canadian forces of the sea and air hurled their strength upon the U-boats.
The Allies fought the U-boats with a combination of radar, aerial patrols, convoys and mine laying.
The turn of the tide was the result of a whole combination of things. It was the result of the continuing evolution of the intelligence system. It was the result of the increase in strength of the escort forces. It was the result of technological developments.
Coastal Command hunted the U-boats from the air, dropping depth charges if and when they encountered their enemy. Searching miles and miles of ocean for a shadow beneath the waves was a monotonous task which required significant physical and mental endurance for the crew to keep alert for hours at a time. The German U-boat campaign ultimately failed. Although the Royal Navy and Merchant Marines suffered considerable losses, Britain's supply line was never completely cut. Germany realized too late that the campaign could have been a winning strategy.
It was a constant battle of offence versus defence and developing technology on both sides. But fundamentally, all these things, together with perhaps the most important, which was the provision of long-range aircraft and air support to the convoys, which created a system which was able to reduce the U-boat threat.
The merchant ships delivering supplies across the Atlantic, the aircraft protecting convoys from above, or hunting U-boats to secure the supply lines, all relied on labour. Labour is a necessity of total war. Without it, the voracious war production machine would be starved. Not only at sea, but on land and in the sky. Women's labour was vital to the successful execution of total war. But the extent to which it was used in different nations at different times in the war varied considerably. Women increasingly filled the gaps in the fields and on the factory floor, left by men on active service. Sometimes women took these roles by choice. Sometimes they were compelled to do so.
You've got this massive involvement of the civilian population in a way that has never happened before. Being a citizen was no longer about just doing your own thing and voting every 5 years or something. It was about, what are you doing to help the war effort?
In Britain, the number of women in the workforce rose from 6,250,000 in 1939 to 7,750,000 at the peak of mobilization in 1943. The expansion was not only in numbers, but in the variety of roles undertaken. In the interwar years, women's work had been regarded as unskilled labor. Married women were discouraged from entering the workforce, but now the nation needed them. When war broke out and labor shortages developed, women, no longer confined to traditional roles, were actively encouraged to leave home to work. They were drawn into manufacturing and agriculture and worked in factories and shipyards across the country. Mining was one of the few fields that remained a male domain. Initially, the British government hoped women would volunteer, setting up War Work Week exhibitions around the country to draw women into employment. But recruitment fell far short of the target set. The exhibition in Worcester, for example, secured 100 volunteer workers. It had aimed for 2,000. For some women, balancing work and family was the sticking point. The jobs on offer rarely catered for part-time hours. Nonetheless, to sustain the war effort, the nation needed workers and volunteers from all quarters of society.
If you think about the war effort, the absolutely massive amount of production for the uniforms, the meals, the weapons, and it's just not enough people going into industry.
As the war progressed, various pieces of legislation mandated women's work. In December 1941, the National Service No. 2 Act was implemented. All single women between 20 and 21 were called up. Married women were exempt, but could volunteer. The powers were extended in February 1942 to all women between 20 and 30, who could be employed only through the employment exchange. This, it was hoped, would ensure that their labor was directed to the war effort.
So they directed you, you had to go, and I think people don't appreciate what that actually means, because you were placed in a factory. You have no power to leave, because you're committing an offence if you leave. And of course, that's why some women took time out, or they were very slow at what they did, because they didn't really want to be there.
Balancing the needs of total war and the needs of family at home was a point of tension for many women. But for others, the war provided an opportunity to undertake roles they could not normally do. Economic motivation was also common.
Many women with children did go into the war effort because, you see, the government paid these things called separation allowance. So a wife would probably only get 30 shillings a week, and that was not enough to pay rent and bring up your children. So most women had to work anyway.
Some women found having to work yielded attractive benefits.
Because the government had taken away your civil rights. In return, you got an awful lot. You got factory canteens, hot midday meals for almost nothing. And there were nurseries, masses of nurseries. I mean, anywhere you want them, you can have a nursery kind of thing. So they got a lot of power. It's full employment. It's not like the interwar years where women were much more deferential and cowed into submission because of in areas where there was unemployment,
The propaganda created around the experiences of women on the home front sought to depict, in a positive light, the varied roles being undertaken to help the war effort. One poster for the Women's Land Army offered women a healthy, happy job. This kind of propaganda was essential in mobilizing women for total war.
There are various kind of tropes or stereotypes which were pushed about. The most obvious one is the long-suffering housewife who's got multiple children. She's juggling everything all the time because she's got to manage on these rations and so on. And then there's the kind of Rosie the Riveter type, the munitions worker who is in the factories, and she may be taking on work similar to what men did, and she's a kind of tough cookie. And then you've got the girlfriend. Glamorous, it's beauty before duty. So she's not going to let the war drag her down, and she's going out and enjoying herself.
It was in the Soviet Union that the contribution of women to the war effort was the most extensive, both on the home front and on the battlefield. The Soviet Union fought the war on a scale and intensity unmatched by other nations. It fought against a war of annihilation and needed every member of society to work together in defense of the motherland. Throughout the 1930s, as the Soviet Union mobilized, women were actively encouraged to consider themselves equal members of Soviet society. This included playing a role in the military.
It was very common, in fact, for women to be encouraged to acquire physical skills and military skills, including parachuting, skiing, shooting skills, and so forth, so that in any forthcoming war they could participate equally with men in armed conflict.
Propaganda in films and newspapers actively promoted women as full participants in the military. Following the German invasion, the Red Army recruitment centers were inundated with women volunteering to do their bit, though they were not always welcomed.
They found they would encounter, let's say, male military recruiting officers who would just tell them, as the phrase went, war is not women's business. So the social reality versus the imagery of what women could really achieve in the Soviet Union at that time was, well, it was a long way apart.
Despite the attitude of some military men, the Soviet Union was fighting a total war, and it needed women. Somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million women served in the military, many in traditional roles such as nursing, but others served in units which shattered gender stereotypes. In October 1941, with the Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow, 3 women's regiments were created in secret.
They were at the time, and probably still are in many respects, a unique phenomenon in the annals of warfare. Out of that came the best known of those regiments, the Night Witches, Air Bomber Regiment.
The Night Witches were all volunteers. Drawn from Moscow State University, they were the educated elite.
These women conducted the nighttime air raids where they literally dropped bombs over the sides of these tiny planes. They won proportionately more heroes of the Soviet Union, the Gold Award, the pinnacle of awards, than just about any other unit of the Red Army.
If the Night Witches were shattering gender expectations from above, snipers were doing the same on the ground. Expertly trained, they took on a dangerous and difficult task.
They would go through rigorous training and then be deployed to usually all-male units as a group of women, or with other male snipers on the front line. Their task was to kill, point blank, as many of the enemy as they could. And there's a most famous, emblematic figure, again, who comes out of this, a woman by the name of Pavlichenko, who was credited with killing 309 enemy soldiers. She was a crack shot.
They played an important role in the military, but women's labor was also in great demand on the home front. With 34 million men conscripted into the Red Army, women were needed to fill the gaps. They volunteered and were later conscripted into jobs in the industrial workforce in agriculture, in construction and transport. In contrast to Britain, women soon worked in the Soviet coal mines. By 1942, over a quarter of all coal miners were women. Girls as young as 12 worked in the factories in extremely harsh conditions.
We're talking about circumstances where food was in desperately short supply, where you were expected to work 10, 12 hours a day in a factory, 7 days a week if need be, to produce munitions or equipment or whatever was required for the military. Food was so scarce, rations were so poor that people were dying in the factories from overwork. All of this while they were expected to attend to their children, tend to the elderly, tend to the sick.
Labor was also extremely scarce in the agricultural sector. Machinery and horses had been commandeered for the war effort. Women's labor powered the plow and ensured food supplies for the armed forces and the urban population, with no guaranteed rations for themselves.
So on their shoulders, really, the home front effort certainly depended, again, in the most arduous circumstances.
In Germany, the needs of total war conflicted with the Nazi ideology. Under the principle of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, women were to remain at home in their traditional sphere. Despite the ideology, millions of women were already working in Germany when the war began. In May 1939, 14,626,000 women were working. The number did not increase substantially. In 1944, 14,897,000 were at work. The impact was less in the numbers recruited than the type of work undertaken. Between 1939 and 1941, the number of women working in heavy armaments increased. Women also drove trains and buses, in the postal service and on the land, replacing men who had been conscripted. They did their year of duty and helped ensure the home front carried on. As the war progressed and the Wehrmacht's losses steadily increased, women were recruited to replace men. But even in such circumstances, they remained within relatively defined gender roles. They worked as typists, as radio and searchlight operators. They were assistants on the AA guns, but they had no military status and they did not fire weapons. In addition to being ideologically driven, this reluctance to fully mobilize women was also reflective of Hitler's broader reluctance to embrace total war.
Hitler, interesting enough, I think, was quite wary about total war. In theory, he was in favor. Goebbels was pressing most for total war. He had some success, but Hitler kept trying to modify having that. And when Goebbels wanted to close the theatres and horse racing and so on, Hitler said, we must leave people entertainment, So Hitler was not a radical in the total war. He went along with it in the sense that he realized that more people had to be mobilized.
Hitler resisted mobilizing for total war until July 1944, when it was arguably too late. As was the case in Germany, Japan struggled with the dichotomy between women's traditional gender roles and the needs for mobilization in total war. Women were initially encouraged to support the war effort through traditional supportive roles, fundraising and home front groups, and were not mobilized until late in the war.
The women and children in Japan are mobilized, but they're not mobilized as soldiers. They are mobilized as supporters of the imperial project. And therefore, unless they're living outside of Japan itself or near the front where they will see what's happening, the news is so winnowed, the news is so carefully constructed within Japan that that sort of history won't have found its way in.
Eventually, the demands of total war and mounting losses meant the nation was forced to draw women into the labor market.
We do see a mobilization of young women who will ultimately, by 1943 and 44, because of labor shortage, be moved into factories. So there is an industrialization of the younger female labor force, and of course moving them from school into the factories where they're making bombs and whatnot.
By March 1945, close to 500,000 Japanese women had joined the volunteer labor corps. Societal pressure meant it became difficult for women to resist signing up. Yet women were still encouraged to marry if given the opportunity, and were immediately exempt from service if they did so. As air raids on Japan became common, and defeat seemed more and more likely, women were drawn into home defense.
We don't see the weaponization of the female side of the Japanese population until late 1944, 1945, where almost a kind of last-ditch effort will take place, and we see these in the front of magazine covers where women who are literally only armed with bamboo spears or some sort of gardening tool almost are being trained. But one wonders if it's not just for the visual impact or the idea of you need to defend the motherland. If it had actually happened, it would have been an immense slaughter.
Whether they were mobilized by compulsion or contributed to the war effort voluntarily, few on the home front could avoid some kind of interaction with a war that stretched across the globe. Although Japan was slow to mobilize women's labor, the mobilization of the economy was more reflective of a total war effort. The amount of the government budget committed to defense rose from 69% in 1931 to 85% in 1944. The extent to which nations mobilized for and fought a total war varied. When resources were scarce within their borders, leaders looked beyond them for raw materials and populations which could feed a total war. Mobilization significantly changed the lives of people at home, but these experiences of total war paled in comparison to those who lived in the path of advancing armies. For those who experienced it, occupation was a brutal shock. Many were killed or assaulted by advancing armies, displaced or forced to flee their homes. Some endured as best they could, and others gathered together to resist the advance of total war.